One armed vet inherited a broken windmill for 22 cents. 3 girls ran it. The deed was written in pencil. I remember that. Pencil, not ink, like whoever wrote it wasn't sure it would stick. The paper had a coffee ring on the lower left corner and smelled like somebody's coat pocket, and the county clerk who handed it to me didn't look up from his ledger when he said the previous holder had died intestate and the property had been held in default for 11 years, and the back taxes plus processing came to 22 cents. I paid it with a quarter. He gave me 3 pennies change, slid them across the counter without touching my hand. I think he expected me to put the deed back down and walk out, probably would have given the quarter back. The way he glanced at my left sleeve, pinned up at the elbow, then looked quickly away. I knew that look by then. 7 years out of the war, and I knew it like I knew the sound of my own boots on a wood floor. I put the pennies in my shirt pocket and the deed in my coat, and I walked out into the October wind. That was the day I became a landowner. 43 acres, a sod house with a failed roof, a well that had gone dry or near to it, a stock pen with 3 fence rails missing, and a windmill that had seized up so long ago the vane had rusted 90 degrees off, and the fan blades had shed about half their slats. The whole thing just stood there in the gray sky, turning nothing, pumping nothing, good for nothing except marking the property from the road so you could find the place when you came to pity it or laugh at it. I want to say I had a plan. I didn't. I had $1.63 left after the taxes, a saddle horse named Ardell who had a bad hip but still worked, a bedroll, a hand saw, 2 good chisels, a hammer, and about 40 years of knowing how to make something out of not much. That last part, that was the only thing that ever served me. The sod house was worse inside than out. A family of ground squirrels had the run of the place. The roof had taken in so much water that the left back corner had gone soft, and some of the sod blocks had crumbled down into a pile that was more dirt than structure. The iron stove was there, which was something. It was a good stove, a monarch older than me, heavy, square, the kind that held heat all night if you fed it right. Somebody had left it because they couldn't carry it, and I was grateful for their misfortune. I slept in my bedroll next to the stove that first night, on the ground, with the squirrels moving around in the walls, and I looked up at the stars through the hole in the roof, and I thought about a lot of things I'm not going to tell you about right now. A man alone in a bad place at night, he thinks about his whole life whether he wants to or not. I was 44 years old, and I'd been a soldier, and then I'd been a drifter, and then I'd been a hired hand on other men's land, and I had nothing to show for it but a missing arm and a horse with a bad hip and 22 cents worth of ruined property. That's where I'll let that thought sit. The windmill was the first thing, not the roof, not the well, not the fence, the windmill, because without water nothing else meant anything. I spent 3 days climbing it, one-armed, which takes longer than it sounds, and cleaning the gear housing and pulling the seized brake, and replacing 11 of the fan slats with boards I cut from a cottonwood blowdown I found along the creek. The tower bolts were rusted but not failed. The pump rod was bent at the coupling, but I could straighten it. I straightened it, took most of a morning with a rock and a length of pipe for leverage and my one good arm and my knees and whatever else I had. When the vane swung back to true and the fan caught the wind and the pump rod started moving and I heard water hit the bottom of the stock tank, not much, a trickle but water. I sat down in the dirt at the base of the tower and I did not cry, but I sat there a while. I didn't know I had neighbors until the 4th day. I was on the roof, or what was left of it, laying new sod I'd cut from the creek bank when I heard horses. I stopped and looked, and there were 2 of them coming up the track at a walk. One was a woman. I could tell from a quarter mile that she sat a horse like someone who'd been doing it since before she could walk, easy and straight, no wasted motion. The other was a child, maybe 10 or 11, riding close behind. They pulled up at the stock pen, and the woman looked at the windmill turning, and then she looked at me on the roof. She said that thing wasn't running yesterday. No, I said. My husband tried to fix it for 2 summers, before he passed. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She looked at the sod I'd cut and stacked near the house. She looked at Ardell in the pen. She looked at my left sleeve. Then she looked back at my face and she said, I'm Nora Holt. I run the quarter section east of here. This is my daughter, Calla. The girl, Calla, had her mother's straight posture and her mother's eyes, which were a particular kind of gray-green that I later learned the other 2 daughters had as well, all 3 of them with those same serious watching eyes, like they'd decided early on that the world needed watching carefully and hadn't changed their minds. I told them my name. I told them I'd taken the claim. Nora Holt nodded like she'd already worked that out. "You know anything about wells?" she said. "Some. Mine's been throwing sand for 3 weeks. I can work around it, but if it goes full, it'll take the pump." I said I'd come look at it. She said tomorrow morning if I was willing. I said I was. She turned her horse, and the girl turned hers, and they rode back east, and I watched them go. The woman straight in the saddle all the way until the cottonwoods took them. I finished 3 courses of sod before the light failed. Now let me tell you about Nora Holt's quarter section, because you need to understand what she'd done. Her husband, Ray Holt, had died of a ruptured appendix 18 months before I arrived. He died in 4 days, fast and terrible, in the bed they'd shared for 12 years, and there was no doctor within 40 miles, and there was nothing Nora could do but be there, which she was. She told me this later, plain, the way she told me everything, no performance, no asking for pity, just the facts of it because the facts were what they were. After he died, she had 3 daughters, Calla, who was 11, Rue, who was 8, and the youngest, a girl called Hattie, who was 6 and who had not spoken a word since her father died. Not a word, not in 18 months. The county doctor had been out once and said there was nothing wrong with her physically, and sometimes children did this, and she'd come back around in her own time. That was the extent of his help. Nora had kept the place running. She'd brought in the wheat with Calla's help, the 2 of them cutting and shocking, and the older neighbors coming to help with the thrashing, which was the custom then. She'd kept the stock, 12 head of cattle, and a good milk cow and the 2 horses. She'd fixed fence. She'd caulked the house against winter. She'd done every bit of it, and when I came to look at her well that first morning and saw the place, the clean yard, the tight fence, the house with its whitewashed window frames, I understood immediately that Ray Holt's death had not broken this woman. It had pressed down on her something terrible, I could see that too, but she had not broken. The well had sand intrusion at the casing. I pulled the pump cylinder and found what I expected. The bottom check valve was worn and letting sand work up into the barrel. I had a spare valve seal in my kit, one of the things I'd carried for years because a man who works land learns to carry certain things. I replaced it and reseated the cylinder and primed it, and the water ran clean. Nora was watching from the well curb. When the water ran clear, she put her hand under it and held it there a moment. Then she looked at me. "What do I owe you?" she said. "Nothing. I don't take charity." "It's not charity. I need to know someone nearby. Winter's coming." She looked at me a moment, not softening, not warming, just looking like she was deciding something. "All right," she said. "Come to supper tonight. The girls can meet you properly." I went to supper. Hattie was the one I want to tell you about first, because she's the one who started things, though nobody planned it that way. She was 6 years old, and she had her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's brown hair, thick and straight, and she sat at the corner of the supper table with her plate and ate without looking up, and did not speak because she had not spoken in a year and a half. Calla and Rue talked enough for 3 children. They had questions about my arm, which I answered plainly, because children who are going to ask a thing will ask it, and there is no point dancing around it. I told them I'd lost it at Chickamauga, which was 20-some years before they were born, and Calla wanted to know if it hurt, and I said it did at the time, quite a lot, and Rue wanted to know if I could still do things, and I said I could do most things if I thought about them right. Hattie didn't look up during any of this. After supper, Nora sent the girls to wash up, and she poured coffee, and we sat at the table, and she told me about Ray, and I told her a little about my years after the war, not all of it, not the parts that weren't fit for a kitchen table, just enough that she'd know who she was dealing with. She asked straight questions, and I answered straight. She didn't fill the silence with noise, which I appreciated. Some people are afraid of quiet, and they talk to kill it. Nora Holt used quiet the way a good carpenter uses a level, to check if things were true. When I got up to leave, I went to take my coat from the peg by the door, and I turned and found Hattie standing right behind me, silent as a cat. She'd come from the back room without a sound, and she was standing there with her arms at her sides looking up at me with those gray-green eyes, and I don't know how to explain what was in them. Not fear, not shyness, something more like consideration. I crouched down to her level. My knees were cold from the evening, and I felt them creak, not that I'd admit that. I said, "Good night, Hattie." She reached out and touched my left sleeve, the empty part where it was pinned. She touched it very carefully with just 2 fingers like she was checking if it was real. Then she pulled her hand back and turned and went to bed. I looked at Nora. Nora was watching from the kitchen doorway with an expression I could not read entirely. Something moved through it that she put away before I could name it. "Good night," she said. I rode home in the dark, and the wind had come up from the north, and I could smell the first real cold of the year in it. Winter came the way it comes out there, not gradually but all at once, a blizzard the 3rd week of November that put 2 feet of snow on the ground and drifted it to 6 against anything that stood upright. I'd gotten the roof tight enough by then, and the wood laid in, and Ardell was in the stock shed with enough hay. I was all right. I'd been through worse. But I thought about Nora's cattle. On the 2nd day of the storm, when it broke enough to move, I saddled Ardell and rode east with 2 coils of rope. The rope was for stringing a guide line between the barn and the house, so you didn't get turned around in a whiteout, which could kill you fast on the open plain. I'd learned that from a man in Nebraska who told me about his neighbor who walked out to his barn in a storm and was found in a field 300 yards from his house when the snow melted in April. That story had stayed with me. Nora's place was tight. She'd managed. But she hadn't strung a line between the house and the barn, and she told me plainly that she'd been going out in the worst of it by compass bearing, which was smart but not as safe as a line. I strung the line. I split her wood, she had plenty of it, but it was in large rounds, and she'd been working through it with a splitting maul that was 2 pounds too heavy for one person to swing well for long. I split a week's worth into stove size in an afternoon. Hattie watched me from the kitchen window the entire time. Every time I looked up, she was there. Not hiding, not startled to be seen, just watching. "She does that," Calla said, coming out to hand me a cup of something hot. "She watches people work." "Your mother works," I said. "We all watch Mama work," Calla said. She had a dry way of talking, that girl. She was going to be something when she grew up, I thought. She already was something. I stayed for supper again. It became a pattern through December, through January. I'd come over 2 or 3 times a week, or Nora would send Calla with a message if something needed doing, and I'd ride over and do it. I checked their stock every storm. I fixed the bedroom window that was letting cold through its frame. I replaced 2 rotted posts in the fence along the creek bottom. And every time Hattie watched me, never speaking, never far away. The thing about Hattie was that she wasn't absent. Some people, when they go quiet like that, they go somewhere inside themselves and they're not really there. Hattie was all there. She was watching everything, taking everything in, and you got the sense she was working something out at a pace that had nothing to do with the pace other people worked things out at. She just wasn't ready to say what she'd decided yet. In February, Nora and I were out at the stock pen at dusk, checking on a heifer that had been off her feed, and I was crouched down looking at the animal's hoof. There was a stone bruise, nothing serious. And Nora was standing at the rail beside me, and she said, without any particular preamble, "You could run a line fence along the east boundary, and we could work the 2 places together in calving season. Split the work, split the gain." I stood up. The heifer shifted, and I put my hand on her flank to steady her, and the cold of the February air was settling down like a weight. I said, "That be a business arrangement." "Yes," she said. "You trust me for that?" She looked at me across the heifer's back. The light was going fast, and her face was half in shadow, but I could see those eyes, which were her daughter's eyes, which I'd been looking at for 3 months, and which I still wasn't sure I fully understood. "I trust your work," she said. "I've been watching your work since October." That was Nora Holt. That was her way of saying it. "All right," I said. "All right," she said. We shook on it. Her hand was work rough, and she shook like she meant it without ceremony. We ran a line fence in March, when the ground softened enough to set posts. I dug the post holes one-armed with a bar and a clamshell digger, which takes longer than 2 arms, but it gets done. Rue helped me carry posts from the wagon to the line. She was 8 years old and serious about the work. She counted the posts as she carried them, out loud, everyone. I don't know why, but I never asked her to stop. 47, she said, setting a post against the wire. Good, I said. 48 would be better, even numbers. Fences don't know about even numbers. I do, Rue said. She was right, and I left it at that. Calving season started the first week of April, and we worked both herds together the way Nora had proposed. She was a good hand with cattle, better than me in some ways. She had a quietness around stock that I'd only seen in a few people, the kind where the animals don't startle at her approach. They just shift to accommodate her, like they'd decided she was part of the herd. I watched her with a first calf heifer one cold night when the heifer was in trouble, and it was taking too long. And Nora never raised her voice and never made a hard move, and she talked to that animal in a low, continuous voice that I couldn't make out the words of, but the heifer heard it, and it worked. We saved the calf. I held the lantern and Nora did the work, and we saved the calf. When it was over and the calf was up and nursing, Nora sat back on her heels in the straw, and she let out a long breath, and she looked at me and she said, "Good." Just that good. I had a feeling then. I didn't name it. I went home and I fed the stove and I lay in my bedroll and the feeling was still there and I still didn't name it. It was the last week of April when Hattie spoke. I was fixing the windmill again. The pump rod coupling had worked loose over winter and was chattering, and I needed to get up the tower to tighten it. I'd been going up and down the tower enough by then that I had a system for it. One arm, two legs, take your time, think each move before you make it. Don't rush. The ground is patient. I was about 30 feet up, working the coupling with a wrench gripped between my knees while my one hand held the tower, and I heard a voice from below that I didn't at first recognize because I hadn't heard it before. It was small, it was clear. It said, "You're going to drop that wrench." I looked down. Hattie was standing at the base of the tower looking up at me. Her hands were in the pockets of her coat. Her face was as serious as it always was. I looked at the wrench. She was right. I'd had it balanced across my knee and it was about to go. I shifted and caught it against the tower frame and held it there a moment. Then I said down to her, "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said. And then she turned and walked back toward the house, her hands still in her coat pockets, like nothing particular had happened. I finished the coupling and I climbed down, and I stood at the base of the tower for a while. When Nora heard that evening, she went very still. She was standing at the stove and she turned halfway around and she looked at me and then she turned back to the stove. She didn't cry. I watched her back and I could see that she was pressing something down, pressing it in. And she stood there a moment with her hands on the stove rail, and then she said, without turning around, "She hasn't spoken since Ray died." "I know," I said. A long quiet. "She picked you," Nora said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't grief either, or not only grief. I didn't know what it was. She turned around and her face was composed and she looked at me with those gray-green eyes, and I still couldn't name what was in them, but it was something that went down a long way. "There's coffee," she said. "Sit down." I sat down. We didn't talk much that evening. The girls went to bed. Hattie, on her way past me to the back room, stopped and looked at me with the same considering look she always had, and then she said, "Good night," and walked on. Nora looked at the empty doorway where Hattie had been. Then she looked at me. "You're good with them," she said. "They're good children." They'd follow you." "They follow you," I said. She shook her head. "That's different. They follow me the way you follow someone you need. They watch you the way you watch someone you trust." I didn't have an answer for that. I held my coffee cup and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the April wind was moving against the house. "Nora," I said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "You don't need to." She turned the cup on the table once, a quarter turn. "I know what you're going to say. I want to tell you something first." I waited. "When Ray died," she said, "I told myself I was done, not because I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but because I couldn't see starting over. I couldn't see giving someone that again, having to." She paused. "But I've been watching you since October." "I know," I said. "You told me." "I told you I trusted your work." She looked at me. "That's not what I was watching." The wind moved the house. "What were you watching?" I said. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Whether you'd still be here in April." I sat with that. The stove ticked. Outside, the windmill vane was turning. A slow creak I knew by sound now. The particular sound of that fan in that kind of wind, which was a sound I'd listened to going to sleep for 6 months. "I'm here," I said. "Yes," she said, "you are." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Not my right hand, my left hand, the one that ended at the elbow, the sleeve pinned up and folded. She put her hand on the folded end of my sleeve and held it there, flat and still, and she looked at me. Nobody had touched that in a long time, not like that, not with that steadiness. "Stay," she said. Not asking it like a favor, not like a plea, like she was saying a thing that was true that she'd decided, and she wanted me to know she'd decided it. I turned my hand over inside the sleeve, so I could feel the pressure of hers through the fabric, and I said, "All right." That was it, that was the whole of it. We didn't go anywhere dramatic with it. That's not who either of us was. I moved my gear and my horse to her place over the following week, a little at a time, and we told the girls. And Calla said, "I know." The way 11-year-olds say things they've known for a while, and Rue asked if I'd have to change the fence line, and I said no. And she said good because 47 posts was already not even. And Hattie looked at me with those gray-green eyes, and then went out and stood under the windmill and looked up at it turning. I'd still run the old claim. The windmill and the 43 acres were mine, and I kept paying the taxes on them, which by then were somewhat more than 22 cents. But I worked from Nora's place, and we ran the cattle together, and in the mornings I'd be there at her table when the girls came down. That's a thing I didn't expect, the mornings. I'd been alone a long time. More than a decade of waking up in my own company, in bunkhouses or camp or that sod house, and you get used to the silence of mornings. You make peace with it. But there's a difference between peace with something and not missing what you didn't know was missing. The sound of those girls coming down in the morning. Rue counting the steps, there were 9 of them, she always counted, and Calla's sock feet on the wood floor, the particular sound of it, and Hattie's small weight settling into her chair. Nora at the stove with her back to the room, not needing to look to know where everyone was. The first morning I was there for all of that. I sat at that table with my coffee, and I listened to it, and it was like a room you'd never been in before but your whole body recognized. Hattie talked from then on, slowly at first, carefully, like she was testing the weight of each word before she put it down, but she talked. By June she was talking the way other 6-year-olds talked, in torrents about everything, including things nobody had asked about, and things that had happened before she stopped speaking, all of it coming out at its own pace on its own schedule, which was the Hattie way. She talked to me the most. I don't know why. I didn't try to make it happen. I just kept showing up and doing the work, and she kept watching me do it, and then she started talking to me while I did it, and after a while she started helping. She was small, but she was particular about things. She liked to hand me tools in the right order. She liked to know why each tool and not another. She liked the answers to be true and not simplified. One afternoon in July we were working on the stock tank, cleaning sediment from the bottom, and she was handing me the scraper and the bucket in rotation, and she said out of nowhere, "Do you miss your arm?" I stopped and thought about it. "Sometimes," I said. "Which times?" "When I can't do something fast enough, when I know 2 hands would make it easier." "But you do it anyway." "I do it anyway." She handed me the bucket. "Papa couldn't fix the windmill," she said. This wasn't said to hurt anyone. It was just a fact she was noting in the way she noted facts. "A lot of people couldn't," I said. "It was a bad seized-up old machine." "You fixed it." "Yes." She thought about that. Then she said, "I'm glad you got here." I took the bucket and dumped the sediment over the fence. When I turned back, she was already looking at the next thing that needed doing. August I had a name in the valley. Not a famous one, not a talked-about one, just the kind of name you get when people have seen you over months and decided something about you. The rancher to the north, Beaumont, who had 400 acres and more cattle than anyone, started including me in his roundup labor exchange, which was how the big operations and the small ones worked together. 2 days on my place and Nora's, 1 week on his. It was fair. It was the way things were supposed to work. The first day of Beaumont's roundup, when I rode in with Nora on one side and Calla on the other. Calla was helping her mother that year, learning it. I watched the men there take us in. A one-armed man and a widow and a girl. I saw what they were thinking before their faces settled. Then we worked. By the second day, nobody was thinking what they'd been thinking on the first day. By the end of the week, Beaumont came to me and said I cut horses better than any man he'd hired in 3 years. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like information, flat, like he'd arrived at it by observation and wanted me to know he had, which from Beaumont was better than a compliment. I thanked him and I rode home in the evening, and Nora was at the gate when I came in, which wasn't something she usually did. Usually she was inside by that hour. "How'd it go?" she said. Fine, I said. Beaumont say anything to you. He said I cut horses well. Nora smiled. It was a small smile, not a large one. She didn't have large ones. But it was real. It went all the way up to her eyes, and she reached up and took Ardell's bridle and led him toward the barn and said over her shoulder, I know you do. Those are the moments. People don't talk about those moments because they're not dramatic. Nobody's crying, nobody's making speeches, nothing's on fire. It's just someone who knows you saying I know you do, like it's the most obvious thing, like of course, like it was never in question. That's the thing nobody tells you about that kind of respect. It doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It just stands there, plain as a fence post, and you lean against it and it holds. We got married in October, 1 year after I'd paid the 22 cents. The county clerk who did it was not the same one who'd given me the deed, which was fine. I didn't need the symmetry. Nora wore her good dress, which was dark blue, and Calla did her mother's hair because Nora wouldn't have thought to and Calla thought to. Rue wore her good boots and counted all the people at the ceremony, which was 11, not including the minister. Hattie held my left sleeve during the ceremony. Not my hand, not my coat, the sleeve. The folded, pinned-up end of it in both her small hands the whole time. And when it was over, she looked up at me and nodded, like something had been confirmed. The windmill turned in the October wind. I could hear it from where we stood. There's one more thing, and then I'll leave you to it. That first winter after we were married, when the girls were asleep and the stove was running down toward embers and the house was settling in the cold, Nora and I would sit at the kitchen table sometimes, late, just the two of us. Not always talking. Sometimes playing cards. Sometimes I'd read or she would. Sometimes we'd just sit. One of those nights, February, the ground hard with cold, the windmill still because the air was dead calm, which didn't happen often. She looked up from the book she was reading and she said, You know what the girls call this place now? No, I said. Home, she said. She said it plain, the way she said everything, no decoration on it. Then she went back to her book and I sat there with my coffee and the stove ticked, and outside the windmill sat still and silent and waiting for the wind to come back, which it always did. That was 11 years ago. The windmill is still up. I've replaced the fan twice and the pump rod coupling more times than I can count, and last spring Hattie's boy. She married a good man from the valley, a quiet, steady type, she had taste. Helped me replace 2 of the tower legs that had rusted at the base, and the 3 of us got it done in a morning. Hattie's boy is 22 now, and he's got his mother's eyes, which are his grandmother's eyes, which are a particular gray-green that I have looked into every day for 11 years across a kitchen table, and that I have never entirely figured out, and that I have never stopped wanting to figure out. Nora's hair has gone gray at the temples. She is still the straightest-sitting woman I have ever seen on a horse. She still uses quiet the way a carpenter uses a level. The claim, my original 43 acres, I folded into the main place years ago. The sod house is a storage shed now. The windmill still turns. I paid 22 cents for all of it. I've thought about that figure more times than I can say. It's not about the price. You understand that. It's not about the bargain. It's about what you do with a thing that everyone else wrote off. What you're willing to put into a thing that looks like nothing from the road. Whether you've got the stubbornness and the patience and the willingness to climb a seized-up tower one-armed and stay on it until the water runs. Some men have 2 good arms and they let things seize up anyway. I've known plenty of them. I paid 22 cents and the windmill turns, and when I come in at dusk, my wife is at the stove with her back to the room, and she doesn't turn around to know that it's me. She just knows. That's the whole of it, that's every bit.